Today we have William here with us. He is currently the verbal director for Wolf Owens, but he has obviously had a much longer career than that. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that, but we're going to focus a lot on verbal identity, trying to answer a lot of the questions that I've heard, that he's heard about the process, about the importance of it, about how to go about it, and how do you assess if it's good, things like this. So, William, thank you for being here and accepting to be the first in the Think Editorial podcast. I think background is a little bit important just because I always like to gather a sense of how people became passionate for the subject, especially because you're in a space full of people that are passionate about comms, passionate about writing, passionate about all things verbal communication. So tell me a little bit about your background and how did you arrive to focus on this in the first place?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, Fabio, thank you so much for having me. So I always had literature in my life growing up. I was always a writer. I first kind of got a graduate degree in the highly useful field of German literature. And then I taught literature and languages as a professor. Um, I was also a journalist in music and science, so it's a kind of a checkered past across all kinds of different, writing and literary kind of pursuits. And then, I moved into copywriting on in kind of advertising agencies, and I kind of worked in house. And I think ultimately, what I realized that I loved doing was thinking and working in the branding space, but through a kind of verbal or kind of writing lens. I really found that, branding to me was more conceptual than advertising. It was more symbolic. You were able to really drive impact across an entire organization as opposed to just, only thinking about kind of like, topical marketing, targeted and topical marketing campaigns. So I would say that a love of language, a love of story, that was always the through line. And I think coming from being a teacher or being a professor, it was really a sense that I didn't want this love to be something that was specialized. I wanted to share it with others. I love getting others excited about, telling better stories, about, communicating with language better. And I wanted to kind of, spread the word that it doesn't take a graduate degree to do that. And I think that's kind of how I came into, verbal identity, verbal branding, which is kind of an odd expression. Verbal is kind of an odd expression here, but yeah, that's kind of how I got to where I am. So I feel very lucky because I think it checks a lot of boxes for me, and it's a real pleasure.
I fell in love with branding first. And I always thought, branding was everything in an organization. And I still believe that to a great degree, exactly like how you explain it.
Mhm.
But when I realized how much communication, like how much it depends on comms and the way you say things, especially, and I will make that statement, especially compared to even visual, the way you look, let's say, even when you think of it as a person, it's not just about how I look, it's really about what comes out of my mouth, how I think, which for me all have to do with verbal and with comms. I realize that comms is really everything. And so,
Mm.
do you feel like you're up against a very strong wall when you go to, let's not even take Wolf Rollins, but I mean, you're dealing with clients on this all the time. So you've seen like a wide range of organizations. How prepared are people to kind of, initiate this more balanced approach compared to visual, logo?
I think that I think that we at Wolf Owens have found that there's increasingly more of an appetite for verbal work, and that is indicative of a larger literacy and awareness and a belief around exactly what you're talking about. That, in this sort of, we live in a increasingly kind of dense and cluttered media landscape that is so comms driven that, it's something that folks can't really avoid. And I think sense that, there's a growing sense that not only does communication super important, but that brands can come through, that brands can guide that, right? Because you might think, oh, it's one thing to think, oh, we have a comms opportunity that we need to really act on. We need to shift how we speak. It's another to go, well, brand can help solve that, right? So I think there is definitely still, I would say, lags behind what people think of branding. Often the default is, well, it's the logo, or
Hmm.
maybe it's the color palette, or maybe it's a tagline. But I will also say it's a wall that I'm no stranger. I don't feel like I'm a stranger to, because in academia there's a similar wall just around literature and language. We're always going to have to advocate for it. And I think I would say there's sometimes a sense that, well, anyone's a writer. How is this a specialized thing? How is it that Nike's comms would be different than Samsung's comms? Like, are we just, isn't it just information? I think that can be kind of the default. But I think you are seeing a growing awareness of, oh, hey, this is a key way that our brand comes through. That visual and verbal, they have to work together, right? If your brand has a certain look and feel, but your language and your tone of voice are totally off, there's a huge disconnect, and it's not going to land.
Hmm. Because we talk about, in my, let's say, circle of friends now, we talk about it and we say, okay, we find it a little bit bizarre, when you go to build any kind of site, when you go to build anything really, um, the good designers, I think, or the good strategists or the good directors, they will always tell you, well, we need content first before we can design. And so I
Hmm.
find it so bizarre that, that in the creative space, it's kind of, I think it's a given for a certain level of quality in the creative space. Like it should be a given. And it is when the teams are very well trained, I believe it is. But
Yeah,
then when you go into branding overall, it doesn't seem to be such a, it doesn't seem to be such a given. I don't
yeah.
know. I find it strange.
The website's a good example, and content is a good example. I think there's not always, sometimes there's a sense that, the rules of writing, of good writing, oh, if I'm not a writer, I don't need to know that. It's a specialized thing. I don't want to get my hands dirty. And there's a kind of like an intimidation around it. So part of our job is to sort of, demystify it a little bit. I think so. There's ways that I think are really important to invite other practitioners and thinkers to kind of co-collaborate on this stuff. I think that's something I've realized, like, oh, this isn't really about me doing this. This is about
Mm.
me getting everyone, design, strategy, engagement, everyone else to believe in it and do it together. That's how it will work. So part of it is a kind of political has a dimension to it. One way I think to invite people in is around story. I think there's something about saying, "Hey guys, what's the story here? Let's tell a better story." I don't know why. That's like a approach that just it unlocks people. They're more comfortable around it. And if I'm like designing a website and I'm doing content, then I grab the designer and I grab the strategist and say, "Let's make the story together first before we get down to what's the headline and what's the body copy, right?" And I said, "That's what I need. Let's tell a better story first." And that often I find is, I don't know, it's an unlock, and it helps people feel less skittish around, comms and language and copy for some reason. At a previous agency, it wasn't a verbal department or copywriters; it was story. So
Hmm.
you would be a VP of story or a director of story, and to me there was something so smart and interdisciplinary about that kind of approach. You know what I mean? Because everything has a story to it. UX has a story to it. Doing a brand activation where you're moving through a space and engaging with certain exhibitions, there's a story to it. So yeah, that's the frame that just for whatever reason has been an effective way to help everyone um, collaborate on this stuff, not just the specialists.
I love that also because it taps into a little bit of, okay, on the more positive side, a little bit of like internal culture, and then on the not so positive side, a little bit of ego as well, let's say, because everybody wants to feel represented by the story. So if you start with that, then of course everybody wants to get involved because they either want to be represented or they know that it's going to represent them, or they simply just want to participate for whatever their reasons are. They definitely want to. And it's a good entry point, really. Because I feel that when we look at brand guidelines, for example, many of the largest brands that we know, if they make their brand guidelines public, which not everybody does, but if they do, you see like a tiny portion, sometimes, not always, but sometimes on verbal identity. And usually it has maybe tone of voice, and that's it. We're talking like half a page, 1 page, maybe 2 pages in like very good scenarios. And so, okay, tone of voice, I think in that case, many people maybe understand a little bit better because that's what they, well, maybe not. So why don't we just start there? Like what are the actual components then that you run through when you go through a verbal identity? And is there some kind of order to it, or do you play around? Is it a flexible, kind of structure? Tell me a little bit about that, about the pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think the way that we've kind of at least the kind of Wolf Allen's way to do it is we think about four pillars of it. And you know, they can be kind of flexible. I'm thinking about like if I was just gonna build the most robust verbal identity for a brand that needed everything, it would be across these four pillars, and we think of them as being messaging, voice, naming, and copy. And if messaging we think about as helping us tell a more consistent story across different audiences and for like kind of different kinds of objectives. Voice, we think about it being tone of voice. We don't. It's a funny thing. We don't. We made a decision. I drew a line in the sand. We're like, it's no longer tone of voice because that's confusing a little bit. What's the tone? What's the voice? We had these endless discussions. So we just said voice. Um, and then if voice then is sort of the way if messaging is what we say, organized in what we say, then voice is how we say what we say, right? It's our style, it's our attitude, it is our tone. Then in naming, we kind of break naming into naming generate in terms of like a process. It's like naming generation. So what are the actual names in our brand, in our products and our services? And then we think of we call it nomenclature or naming strategy, right? Like what's the system? Clients come to us and they say, we don't need a new name. What we need is a long-term approach to name things moving forward because our portfolio is cluttered and what have you. And the last bucket's a little bit more, arguably a bit more loosey goosey, but just thinking about copy being like, okay, your taglines, your manifestos, your scripts, your press releases, the actual words on a page that people would see, is kind of like its own bucket. Um, the other pieces of this puzzle that become essential are thinking about how things like messaging and voice modulate or flex, how you apply them. So we do a lot of work around, it's one thing to say, our voice at uh, JP Morgan Chase is clear, optimistic, and uh, dynamic or what have you. But the next click down is okay. How do I lean into one side of our voice more than another side? If we think about, like we say, like everyone on this call has, you have a voice that is yours, that's distinctly yours. I have a voice that is mine. But we still flex it. I'm going to talk a little bit differently now than I'm going to talk to my friends at happy hour or that I'm going to talk to my dog, but even though it's all still me, right? I can flex it. So there's also been that click down around how do you organize that approach to, as a brand, we're going to lean a little bit more one way in this case. We're going to lean a little bit more in this other case. It's still always going to be us. You're always going to know it's us, but there's range to it. How do you sort of think about that range?
What about things like brand personality, or how does this relate to other pieces of, let's say, the larger brand related strategy pieces that we've heard, like brand personality, like brand narrative, for example?
Yeah, those are great. Those are some of my favorite pieces. And I think because they're both sort of strategy, they happen to be kind of like this mix of strategy and identity. And I've always found that space between, let's call it like your hardcore strategy, your God level strategy, as it were, your mission and your purpose and your values, and then your identity, there's this space in between where you need to bridge them. And that gets really interesting. And I will say that I think it's a little bit different for every brand and every business because they're organized a bit differently. The thinking is organized a bit differently. So when you're designing those things, flexibility is really important. Um, Sometimes we think about the personality being something that can drive the brand identity broadly, like it could also drive visual. It could also drive experience. It could also drive culture. It could also drive, if you're a service brand, your personality might also drive how you interact with customers directly. There's no hard and fast rule. But personality becomes the way in which you start to aestheticize the brand. You start to put a face on it. And you can kind of, it's up to you to dictate what it impacts and what it doesn't. So that's where the customization can really come in. Um, I really find personality important because it helps me think about the brand as a person. And that to me has always been the key unlock for designing the verbal identity is because I'm thinking about, I don't think about the brand. I don't think about comms as sort of a business tool. It is a business tool, but thinking about it. I'm thinking about it like it's a conversation between the brand and the audience, and I'm writing dialogue. And to write dialogue, I need to know who the brand is. If they're a character, I need to know: is this character angry? Is this character old? Is this character happy all the time? So that personality to me is a fundamental piece of the puzzle to guide the thinking. And then things like a narrative are really interesting because they can do all kinds of different things, right? A narrative can be customer facing. A narrative can just be an internal tool that you use to sell a strategy, to socialize and kind of sell a strategy to internal stakeholders. Um, but it's always just kind of, to me, a key piece of putting emotion on a brand, especially a brand strategy, right? You think about, oh, our brand strategy or it's this highly rigorous set of ideas. It needs an emotional layer. Like it needs a story. So I love that. I love the power of that because even to just get the own people in your own business to align on a new strategy, you know, I wouldn't say that the rigorous thinking, mission and purpose and values and all these things, I wouldn't say it's enough. Yeah, I think you need that emotional layer to get people to rally them, get them inspired.
I agree that the flexibility is great. I'm wondering how much can you tell me about building in that flexibility though? How do you actually go about, because everything that I hear, not everything I hear, sorry, let's say majority of the time or traditionally, we've heard a lot about rigidity, branding was always a little bit like that, the fencing in, the very strict guidelines, the very how do you do things differently? How do you make it flexible enough for people to also, feel like they can make it their own and get excited, like you say, to use it, to leverage it?
Just to observe that at the beginning of a branding process, I think you're absolutely right that there is a strong need to declutter if you're trying to kind of arrive at what your okay, what is our let's say you're just gonna undergo a branding process. You're gonna go, okay, well, you're gonna need to something that we really go out of our way to try to encourage clients to do is to give up. First of all, give up. I mean, give up certain things, not give up altogether. Give up, clients. No. Um, what are you if you're gonna move forward in how your brand is coming to life? There are things you're going to have to give up, most likely. And the sort of mantra is strategy is sacrifice, which I love, right? A lot of times they have clients that say, no, but you need to help, please help us with Volans. You need to tell the world that we are these 30 things that they're all really important to us. You got to figure it out. And we're like, no, no, no. Half of this has got to get out of here. You got to find some center of gravity. There's a sacrificial layer that has to happen. So I think that's when you speak about needing to establish some kind of rigidity or needing to sort of clean house a little bit. That's sort of like the first step to arrive at that core. And then you're going to figure out how that core is going to kind of modulate or flex. And, part of it is thinking about those tools that I was speaking about around, for example, modulating a voice or a message, you're thinking about, okay, what's the range that we need to kind of express these things across? The other piece though is thinking about the tools that you provide, like the verbal identity tools, your messaging framework, your voice framework. Um, is to be able to design them and to train people to think of them as springboards and launch pads, which I really try to do. I really try to go to the practitioners and say, hey guys, this is a, a kit of tools for you. You still are going to be the one who's going to bring them to life. And you are going to find new ways to flex these that we haven't thought of. And this will grow as you use it, right? This is this is a launch pad for you. It helps you, counteract the blank page and it helps you give you a direction of travel to go in. but it's not intended to box you in, and it's not intended to punish you if you do it wrong. It's intended to be a springboard. So it's never presented or sold or trained as this is the be all end all. But as like, here's this foundation you can work with, and it will grow. The system and the users will kind of grow and evolve together. And to that point, I always encourage, that someone within the brand team owns it and can evolve it. And I don't know, someone uses it to write new social posts, and you go, oh, hey guys, I think, we realized that our sense of humor needs to be a little bit articulated a little. We thought we were irreverent, but actually we're playful. We need to kind of adjust that. Like, it should be a living document. And it should be something that everyone goes back to, but that isn't, set in stone.
Do you have any examples of how creative ways that you've seen verbal identity be actually delivered to everyone else? Because generating this excitement, what I often find is we build these guidelines, we put them somewhere, we tell you what the benefits are, but then the guidelines just sit there and you kind of need to go yourself and access and understand and things like this. Tell me something more creative that people can do so that we stop seeing, just this like, left on my desk. Big.
Yes. I'm always trying to look for more of those myself. I think so. The training piece, the socialization piece is super important, because I think it's always like my nightmare as we were talking about. You just do this work and then you're like, "Cool, I have this PDF," you know, uh, so how do you then, get people to internalize it? How do you get them to be excited about it? There's different, tactics for sort of socializing it. We've done like kind of master classy TED talky like videos where, the head of design is sort of speaking to you and walking through it. And that's even more, a little bit more engaging than a PDF. PDF is the world's least engaging way to do this.
Yet the most common way to do this,
Yes, absolutely.
ironically.
Absolutely. The other Another way to do it that I love doing when I have the opportunity is to do really kind of like interactive workshops that I find really, really effective. And those are often like they're kind of two-step workshops. You basically um you bring in instead I'm working with an in-house team. I was working with an in-house team that was very robust for like a global cosmetics brand. And, you bring them in for one session and you basically give people a homework assignment and you say, here are these tools, take them away, apply them to something that you are currently working on and come back to us and tell us how it went. It really works the best when your identity, or your tools aren't entirely set in stone and there's room to kind of tweak and evolve them. It's more it's more engaging for the practitioners, and it helps impact the work, right? Because you can pressure test it. If you say, hey, we're working on this, we need your input, rather than these are the new rules, please memorize them. Right. Please go test drive this stuff. And this particular example, it came back and there were people writing in Italian, there were people writing in Mandarin. Um, and that was super fascinating. For example, the writer writing in Mandarin, we had guidance around how to talk about luxury and how to sound like you're a luxury brand. And of course, we're reading her work in translation. There's a question of translation there, but by and large, her writing sounded, I would say, more premium than some of the other writing. And there was an interesting difference. And she's like, this is kind of the standard for writing in this uh, language and in this culture. There's these cultural differences that were fascinating. Um, so that helped us sort of fine tune the guidance that we were providing. Right. That's another way to kind of just bring people in and help them kind of like live and breathe it rather than just, seeing it on a page.
Hmm. Interesting. And are there any differences in the process between what you would do for a B2C brand versus a B2B brand, for example?
I would think just in terms of process for B2B versus B2C, that B2B is, from my experience, often going to have, um, there's often going to be with B2B, like more hoops to kind of jump through or watch outs, right? If you're like a healthcare brand, finance brand. B2Bs, the two challenges here, I would say, they're often more technical and there's often legal considerations, right? With healthcare or pharmaceuticals, you can legally not do certain or say certain things, right? Um, if you're a tech company or a software company, your product might just be very complicated. And a lot of times, like let's say you're like you're a software tech brand who develops solutions for other businesses, and you're like, we need to expand our business. We're tired of talking to just the IT buyers of our clients. We want to be able to talk to the C-suite execs. That to me right away is a verbal identity challenge because that's right away like literally we're trying to communicate to a different audience. But when we're talking to our IT buyers, they're very technically skilled and we don't have to dumb our language down. Basically, we can just
Mm.
be very technical to them. But we want to, we want to expand our business. We want to get a bigger piece of the pie. We're shooting now for these C-suite execs. How do we talk to them? So that's the other kind of hurdle often with B2B brands is just, it is helping them translate and sort of de-jargonify their language a lot. So those big challenges, your process would be that you're building in time to work through those and that you're from a kind of immersion standpoint, you are making time to connect with those stakeholders and making sure you are. We need to connect with it. If it's pharma, let's connect with the legal team. If it's a technical brand, let's connect with the engineers. Like just building that time in to get the inputs that you need. I think would be key specifically to B2B.
You mentioned something that kind of is a it's an important word for me, so I'm just going to jump off of that for a second. Um, because you talked about, okay, for IT, for example, we can speak a certain way. For C-suite, for example, we need to talk at a higher level. And first of all, I love the example because we were just, I was just mentioning earlier that I feel like verbal identity or comms in general are just part of everything. But I have a thing for specificity for anybody that knows me. So when you say things like, if we want to talk to the C-suite, then we need to kind of speak at a higher level. My immediate alarm goes off to say, okay, but how do we do that while avoiding the trap of sounding like everybody else? Because there's only so much lack of specificity you can have before the brand names become interchangeable, because a lot of the messaging that we see, a lot of the words that we do see for all the PDFs and all the pages that are created for verbal identity, a lot of the things that we see from a messaging perspective are not enough. They're not enough for the customer to truly differentiate the brand, and they're not enough for internal practitioners or communicators to truly differentiate the brand. So how do you see that? Because this is probably one of the things I contend with the most on a daily
Is
basis.
like I'm trying to put my finger on your question here. Is it around how we can kind of modulate the voice or modulate the verbal
No,
identity or how
how do you maintain some kind of distinction? How do you,
yeah.
is it more about creativity? Is it more about research? I'm not the biggest fan of competitive strategy or competitive research, but you know
Uh-huh.
what I mean.
Yeah.
How do you make it different if you're also expected to, I don't know. I'm thinking also about, the common rule, not rule, but suggestion that people make where they say, make it simple to understand, make it so that a fifth grader could understand it. Make it so that I
Right.
just feel like there
Right.
are so many forces guiding us maybe in the not so right direction. I'm wondering if you see that as well.
That's interesting. I mean, there's a couple things that work here. Yeah, you don't want it to be if like one of your challenges in how you can communicate is that you need to be like a simple one. Like we need to be more clear. We need to be more clear and direct because of the audiences we're trying to reach. That's never going to be. That's going to be one element within your identity. Um, so the way that I might make my language more clear might be different than the way that you do it because it's still
Mhm.
like that's just one element kind of in your toolkit. So I think it's important to think about how all these things work together. I think sometimes like in the context of voice, we'll show clients like, okay, here's the core elements of your voice. You are optimistic, dynamic, clear, and fun. And they might start poking at one of them and be like, well, that's not right. And then we want to say, okay, let's look at it, but we need to look at this together. These things all work together to your point. The question is around how do you stay distinct? Then I would say like something specific like, oh, as a brand, when we speak, we always make it as clear and direct as simple as possible. Um, it's how that works in concert with the rest of it that will make it distinct. It's not, I wouldn't even say that there's one, I don't even know if like ever just one attribute or one trait can really be that distinct. What's going to be distinct is the alchemy of them all kind of coming together.
Hmm.
I would say. I think the other kind of key piece of like broadly speaking, we're trying to um, keep your brand distinct. Then I just think about like in my mind, Flavia, I have a triangle in my mind. And
Okay. Tell me about the
so
triangle.
say about this triangle. There's a triangle where it's the 3 points on the triangle are audience, category, and brand.
Okay.
And what I'm always trying to do is to hit every part of the triangle for effective work. And that is, does it resonate with my audience? Is it different in the category? Is it authentic to the brand? If I could do all of those things, then I'm doing it right. Then it will have the effect I want to have. It will be distinct. We will not sound like anybody else. Right.
Hmm.
Because it's not enough to just be different in the category. That's too broad. You don't know if that's going to work. If you're just going to be different, you know, uh, uh, Bank of America could suddenly sound like no bank you've ever heard before, but it could be the absolutely wrong thing to do, you know? So it's about like these 3 things all pulling on each other and balancing each other that I think they work together right, then that sort of distinction will come through, I think.
Hmm. This is why I like, for example, and I agree with you that thinking about brand as a person works very well because, people are unique in and of themselves. So finding some of that. And so that's why I asked even about, brand personality, because I feel like maybe that is a little bit representative of this combo of elements that kind of shows up, makes you feel something, showcases some kind of intention, just like a person. And so I want to take just a moment to go back on that to see if you can give a little bit more detail as to how you actually uncover a brand's personality. I'm not going to say build it because I think in many
But
places we might agree that it's already there. You're just trying to like piece it together. But how do you go about actually finding out what a brand's personality should be?
the first thing in terms of process that I'm doing is, I think we're always in the branding process starting off and kind of like doing detective work, right? Think about it as that's the emergent phase. And I'm going through and we're doing stakeholder interviews and we're kind of like, looking at everything that the brand puts out to the world. And I'm looking to, I'm looking to be excited by something, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm looking for little nuggets where I go, oh, that's interesting. That feels like I haven't seen that in this category. Or, sometimes you're finding a little nugget of gold that's hidden in the sand. A brand has done something, but they've never beat it once and they never codified it. They never owned it. It's a little one off thing. And you're like, there's something over there. That's interesting. I don't know. It feels like you've got a metal detector on a beach or something and you're kind of searching around and trying to find a nugget. Um, so looking for nuggets is the first thing. What feels like you always want to start with what feels really true to a business and a brand, and you ask stakeholders also like, tell me about the culture here. What kind of people work at this company? What, is everybody like a striver and an innovator and everyone gives 110%? Or is it that, it's a culture of collaboration and deep respect and work-life balance and well-being? Those things will start to feel like those are what become really true for the brand. And that's ultimately what the personality has to do is it has to connect and be reflective of something very deep about the brand and the people, or it won't, or it'll be superficial, or it'll be lipstick on a pig, and you'll be like, "Oh, this brand is super dynamic. Wait, everyone who works here is really boring towards their product." There'll be no deeper connection you can make any personality you want, but if it doesn't clearly emotionally connect to deeper things in terms of the brand and the product and the business, there's no deeper story there. So the first thing I'm doing is really digging deep with the client to find that. And the other thing that I'm doing is to unpack the we think of it as roles and relationships. If I want to think about the personality of the brand, the character of the brand, I need to think about the role that it can play in the category and the world and in people's lives. I need to think about the relationships with the audience that it wants to foster. But I'm a big believer in just in terms of verbal identity of having a deliverable that it is like the brand character. Because personality is often like a set of traits. Your personality is you're fun, you're dynamic, what have you. Um, the character is more like you give the character a name, and it's written up more like it's like a persona, right?
Hmm.
And
Okay.
that I'm a big advocate for because it's a quick uh tool to get in a headspace. You know, if you're
Yeah.
sitting down and writing or telling a story, I can go through all the rules, right? And go, did I do this? Did I do this? Or or I can think about like who is this person? You have to give that person a name, and then it's like you're embodying them. So for this one cosmetics brand, for example, this cosmetics brand needed to own its expertise. They were really the experts in eyebrows. So in part of the identity, the verbal we created for them, we had this brand character that was the fun-loving beauty genius. And that was someone
Wow.
who loved sharing their knowledge of beauty and cosmetics in a fun way. It's like your friend who's like kind of a nerd and they just know a lot about something and they just love sharing it. And it was a way to make it feel like the user or the customer was in this space that we thought of as the beauty locker room. You know,
Yeah.
if you imagine like beauty as a category can be intimidating. There's all these standards and rules. You always feel like you're doing it wrong. So you needed a person that would want to play with you. It wouldn't fight you to play with beauty, to play with expressing yourself. So that character was a way to like articulate that in this very tactical, tangible, exciting way. Not just like, here are the rules you must follow when you write.
I think it requires such an interesting balance between subjectivity and objectivity. Like you want those stakeholders to come in and tell you their personal, unique experience or perception of what this should be, or, but then also you want to draw some objective lines because you can't just go, the brand at the end of the day is something outside of all of everyone,
Yeah.
participating in the process. How do you see that balance between kind of like how do you land? How do you land properly somewhere between those things when it really is a group of people trying to decide for an even larger group of people, which is something else we can talk about afterwards. But
Yeah, yeah, and that is a great question. A small group of people deciding for a large group of people, I think, is a great way to think about what that challenge is. I think what you're making me think of, and what I'll add into this question is, um, when you're looking at with clients that are, okay, we've heard from everybody. Uh, everyone's told us their sort of personal subjective spin
yeah.
on what is this brand, what's this business, why do I care about it? And you're sort of trying to sum it up and put a point on it and play it back to them. Um, one of the filters is what's current state and what's aspirational, and that's something that you're always trying to balance. Maybe that's a useful lens to think about what you're talking about. What should we? What's reflective of who we are now, and what do we need to kind of sometimes there's elements in a brand that even the verbal identity you're like, that's not really who we are now, but it is should who we should want to be moving forward. And if you got to kind of find the right mix, the right balance of those things. If you go too far and make something that's totally aspirational, then it's not going to land either. But if you just reflect current state and say, this is, it can't just be a mirror. It cannot be actually just an accurate representation of where the brand is now, because the whole point is to move it forward. So you're kind of trying to balance that sense of this is who we are now and this is who we can be.
What if you are reinventing yourself regularly like an adolescent who doesn't really know their identity yet?
I would want to know, what is driving that perpetual adolescence? If that's a specific case, what is it within the organization that is causing this kind of constant reinvention? Is it dissensus within? Is it a shifting marketplace where the product offering keeps changing?
Mm.
What's at the core of it? We've sort of joked that a lot of what we do is brand therapy, brand therapists. If we go in with the client, they're like, "Oh, we're caught in perpetual adolescence. We don't have coherence. We're at odds." Then I would want to put the brand on the couch and start asking, "Where's that coming from? Let's start there."
Are we saying then that some structure is better than no structure, even if it's not the ideal structure that you would have wanted? Like, is some identity better than no identity, even if it's not exactly, I want to say optimal? Because you come from a perspective of being hired to do this. There are many of us that, for example, we're not hired to do this. We're part of organizations where we believe this is the right way to go, and we
Yeah,
we don't know how to become wanted. A little bit more like your literature in the educational space example. Like
yeah,
we're kind of trying to fight for our right to party, so to speak. So I think that's where maybe a lot of this, desire, but also tension and trying to figure out what the best footing is when maybe the others, don't even know that this is important yet. Like we haven't
yeah.
even gotten there.
What you're making me think, I think it's important to kind of consider in this question. So I love this hypothetical that we're talking about. How do you navigate um, an organization where stakeholders hold differing views on the brand? There's not alignment. This sort of dissensus is would most likely be partly political, but it can also because, oh wait, as a business, we have to keep changing our product and our offer and where we sit in the market, and that's changing how we think about how we show up and our personality, right? So it can be a mixture of internal and external pressures. If it's internal, I think the thing to add and make me think of Flavia is I would set out at the beginning of a branding process and get the stakeholders together and say, guys, here's what we're going to accomplish together. Here's the goal that we're going to set. Here's what this work can do. Here's the impact it can have. Because you want folks to be bought in on why that consensus is important. So why should I give up, my personal view on what the brand is? If I
Mm,
think I'm right, but if you set the stage of, guys, if we don't, we're going to remain in this adolescent space. We're going to be trying on new hats we're going to be goth one year and punk the next year. So setting the goal around why do we need to find, let's say, a personality that is a mix of everybody's take. That's an ideal mix. Why is that valuable? Get them to work together from the beginning with a sense of what are we driving towards? What's the impact it can have? I think would be potentially extremely helpful. And also recognizing that, guys, we're in a sense going to create a brand is in a sense like a group portrait of everybody's different points of view. It's not going to be any one person's exact take. It's going to be, we're doing this portrait together. So it's going to sit somewhere in the middle of all of our opinions.
hmm.
So I think it's just sort of maybe having from the outset that sense of cooperation and that group outcome that we're driving towards.
But see, this is the interesting thing also is that you mentioned stakeholders, but what role does the rest of the organization play in the actual construction of the brand, the brand identity, the the personality, et cetera? What about the rest of, because I feel like the stakeholder groups are always very small, the
Yeah,
few deciding for the many. And I understand that their positions, or if they are founders, for example, their knowledge of the history or of, why they started this, they have that piece of the puzzle. I get it. But
yeah,
there's still an entire growth that has happened since then that encompasses this, larger population of people. How are they brought in to the process?
yeah,
And can that help the explanation that you were just giving now? Can that help you say, this is what the entire organization is kind of feeling. This is what they're thinking, the power in numbers,
yeah.
stakeholders.
As stakeholders is a great question. I would think about um, first organizing it around like the three parts. We're gonna go. Let's say we're just talking about like a branding process, um, of which verbal would be a part, of course. But I think it also applies for strategy, for visual identity, for experience. These other things that you could do in a branding exercise. And I would think about how who do we need to speak to in within the organization at the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Hmm.
Whose inputs do we need to start the work, in sort of key stakeholder interviews, and across different parts of the business, the C-suite, the product leads, if it's for example, I'll use the example of a hospitality. We're working with a resort brand in the Caribbean.
Hmm.
So we need to speak to the actual host, like property managers. We need to speak to the boots on the ground folks. Who do we need to get their opinion to start the work? Then then there's who needs to be brought along in the journey. Who do we need to co-create with as we're doing it? Which is probably your core, probably marketing team, but probably also a few key practitioners. If it's visual identity, you're going to want to be working closely with the creative director and the designers. If it's verbal, you're going to be working closely with like the copywriters and the marketing leads. Um, the other folks you're co-creating with at some point are founders or execs, right? They're probably appearing at kind of like key milestones or stage gates. And then who shows up at the end? Who shows up? Who needs to be brought in terms of what we think of as training and socialization? You
Hmm.
know, um, and what is that like? Still within training and socialization, who needs to be aware of the tools and who needs to use the tools every day and really like own and believe in them, right? And that's also different, in terms of verbal, the writers need to know how to use it. But then also like the market, whoever's reviewing the copy, whoever's helping it get out into the world, also needs to know.
Yeah.
um, I'll add that I often really feel like there's an assumption that only copywriters need verbal identities. And I think we really, really try to reframe that. Everyone writes. Everyone in your organization is writing.
Yeah.
Kind of to your point, right? That's so that belief in the power of comms. Everyone's doing it all day. It so blows my mind sometimes when folks look at the verbal identity piece and think, oh, okay, well, that's for this copywriter. We only have two copywriters, so only they need to know how to use it. I'm like, you're all of you are speaking and writing all freaking day. This is helpful for everybody. And the example I give is, so I used to be for a spell, I was the copy lead at Equinox. So at their in-house kind of, the creative team was sort of mini agency. Um, and I will say that every single person at Equinox could speak Equinox. The personal trainers, when they're pitching a new class internally, and they're like, I've got a new idea for a cardio class, and here's the class idea, here's how it works. They all could, it all sounded on brand, which I love, but it sounded on brand not because they all read the PDF, kind of to your point, right? It was on brand because there was a culture. It was basically like it was sort of self-fulfilling, but it was like everyone was on brand because everyone was on brand. Like it was just something that was in the air. Everyone was breathing. You knew what was going to be right and what wasn't, just intuitively. And it was beyond just, oh, we had a training session. Now we all magically know how to do it, right? It's in terms of training and socialization and bringing people along is one thing. The ultimate goal is that this is something that we all do without having to look at a PDF. We just know it. And that takes time. And that takes kind of like, that takes also believing that that's valuable to everyone.
Yeah, see, and that's why I find it super interesting the question of, okay, so we give the example of Equinox. And I can't put my finger on it whether Equinox was the success or is the success that it is from a let's say boys perspective, very much so, is because the people at the top knew what they were doing and they landed on the right one that then everybody felt able to like appropriate or align with? Or is it because they did do some kind of, and maybe you know the answer because you were there, but I don't know. Or is it because they did some kind of more grassroots effort where more and more of the population actually contributed to what the, higher up stakeholders ultimately decided as being the identity.
I don't think there was ever a moment where you were sort of going, hey, group fitness instructors, let's help craft the verbal identity. It was more like, but you do want it to feel like it, that their approach and their sensibility is inspiring the work, right?
Okay.
It's more like being sort of aware and inspired by it.
Okay.
But what I'll say, my boss there, um, at Equinox, Liz Nolan, who really sort of drove a lot of this, was very effective at synthesizing a lot of very complex things around the identity and the strategy into three pillars that were sort of the
Mm.
Equinox personality: masterful, elevated, and provocative. And she was very effective at cramming so much into these three that you didn't need a framework for this part of the brand and a framework for that part of the brand. And there's a visual thing and a verbal layer and values and behaviors. And, it's
Hmm.
easy to create this like brand onion of 1,000 frameworks. And then no one really knows where to look to. It was just, is it, whatever you're putting out into the world, is it masterful, elevated, masterful referring to like our expertise being at the head of the category, elevated being its premium luxury, provocative having a bit of that edge. That was just she just beat it into everybody's head so everybody knew it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And that, whenever we're doing pillars or principles or character, it's always like 4 things and 5 things and all this. And I'm like, 3 is just, three is a magic number, right? Uh, so it is like, setting
Yep.
that ambition, the more that you can do that and simplify it and make it super, super clear, the more you can get people behind it. And that it's better to do that sometimes than to have like a really nuanced approach with like 1,000 little tools. It's just like, no, guys, let's just all really get behind these 3 things. It's not going
Hmm.
to solve every problem. You have to decide, am I going to solve every problem or am I going to get the whole organization around 1 or 2, 3 things? Like, what's more important to you? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Uh,
That's what I was saying. Some
yeah,
structure instead of no structure is
right,
probably a little
right.
bit what we're
Yeah.
getting at.
And like sometimes we're developing, like, for example, we're developing like messaging frameworks, and it's like, oh, we solved for every single message in this thing, and have we
Mm.
varied it for every single possible audience? I'll have to be like, guys, like we're doing messaging for this resort, and I'm like, this resort company is enormous, and it has people from all over the Caribbean working there, and I'm like, I think it's best if we just have 2 or 3 things that are super consistent. Let's really nail that. That will have more of an impact than something where we solve for every possible, permutation, every possible case. So it's kind of like it's customizing a tool to make the most impact.
Hmm. I like that a lot. And I think that it also ends up affecting so many other parts, maybe unexpected parts of the organization as well, because I'm also thinking, if I go back to Equinox for a second, just because I think, yeah, it's a good example, but I wonder if they also hire and fire according to these according to these 3 principles.
Yeah, like there's a dream um that your employer brand and your brand have a lot of congruence and harmony. And that the way that I think that is exactly the aspiration. And it may not be that you literally look at candidates and go, are they masterful and prerogative? But there should be some sense of here's our brand. And then here are the people that we look to be part of our brand.
Hmm.
And then here's also our internal culture. Here's how we treat each other, behind the scenes. And you do want those things to all feel like that you're walking the walk, that where you put out into the world, what's happening, you know, within your own 4 walls are connected 100%.
Mm. We were talking about stakeholders, and I remember talking to a very high up design executive at Coca-Cola, and he's like, I think verbal identity is incredibly important, he says. And I also agree with you that I think it should be more prominent. He said, but what I've found is that people don't know how to give feedback on verbal identity. So then they just stay quiet. So then not as much gets done, or it doesn't feel as important to the group. Because when you have something that's visual, people immediately know how to critique it. But when it comes
Hmm.
to something verbal, they don't understand how, so then they don't do it. So
Yeah.
what is the feedback process like? Or what, how do you prompt how do you prompt people to give feedback on a verbal identity? Is it simple? Is it complicated? Is it
No, that's a great question. From my experience, has been entirely true. Like, uh, it's partly why, like, even just in moments where, like, let's say we're doing an hour-long meeting with a client and we're going to review visual and verbal work together. I say, please, can we do verbal first? Because once folks look at pictures and shapes and colors, the brain, and I get it. I love the visual side. I love going to museums. I love looking at art. I love, all that kind of stuff. As soon as your brain goes there, it's more like immediately sensorial and fun. It doesn't want to click back and look at words. You know what I mean? So it's like kind of a little bit like make them eat their vegetables first before they can, like, go into like the logo land and go, oh, I love the elegance of this swooping line or what have you. So it's a little bit more because you think when you look at words. People don't like thinking. So how can we make them excited to think, excited to
yeah,
look at language and feel confident to be able to provide steers and guidance around it, you know?
yeah,
So because what can happen is either sometimes it can be they don't know what to say, or they say, it sounds great. It's also like what I not my favorite thing to hear is we like all of it. Cause I'm like, okay, you don't like all of it. Like, if you give me a real, tell me as soon as they say we love a lot of it, here's one thing that we really need to change about what you're showing me. I'm like, great. That means you are actually engaged and you feel confident having it about it. So a little bit of is like figuring out how to not overwhelm, right? Figuring out how to even just identify stuff like, look, I'm going to show you two versions of the same paragraph. Over here, we're being more bold and authoritative. Over here, we're being more friendly and empathetic. Like, just sort of signpost things, make it clear. Um, think very clearly about what decisions we need to make. Don't make them review the whole thing, whatever it is. Don't make them review the whole thing. Be like, I need you to decide, here's the two levers I'm going to give you to pull. We'll take care of the rest. It's designing the right set of decisions that needs to be made where folks feel like they're along for the journey. They get it. They know it's at stake. I think like a lot of it is like they understand what happens if you make a certain choice. You know, if we go this certain route, these are the consequences. Those types of ways out kind of guide decisions. And yeah, I think it is just about having this ambition of demystifying, helping people know that they've always had those tools in them. They shouldn't, feel like they don't need to be on the defense.
yeah. Getting people excited about language. I mean, like, I think
Yeah,
that's definitely
yeah,
we're all struggling with that in concert, which is okay. We're not alone, at least. But um,
yeah.
I think the last question I would ask you is, how do you know if the verbal identity you've set is actually good? Like, how do you know that you've done it right?
I think about the triangle first of all. Did I? That's my first
Yeah.
filter. Is it true about the brand? Does it feel different in the category? Can I believe that it will resonate with audiences? Like,
Mhm.
that's the huge piece, right? Now, you really can't, dude. I cannot tell you how many times I have to ask and beg for audience insights or audience research. Who am I talking to? I feel that's like maybe even not as important as it is for visual identity sometimes, but for verbal identity, I'm like, am I talking to college educated people in their 50s? Am I talking to a small host of fintech experts? Who am I talking to? And so many times clients are just like, everyone, this brand's for everyone. I'm like, get out of here. It's not. No brand is for everyone. So a big part of that is I know it's working is I could show that this is for a specific group of people, So we recently worked with a fintech brand that had a very, very clear ambition for how they were shifting their audience. And they told us, we're an app. We've always been for everyone. Oh,
Mhm.
fin, finance for everybody can invest. You can be a goofball. You don't know anything about money. It's fine. And they're like, it's not working. We're pivoting to be much more about a specific subset of like power users who are more informed. And I was like, I love this brief because it has a specific, I know who I can talk to. Thus, I can more easily judge it's effective or not. And can I clearly see this audience being reflected in this work? That's specific, right? Sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes it's not like a very targeted audience. That's a lot broader. So I think it is about those three filters. Um, I think more kind of emotionally or through a more kind of creative lens, is that it feels, this is sort of subjective and kind of woo woo, but that it feels alive, that it feels like a person, like there's a sense there. I can sort of just step back for a second, and then there's, as the kids say, a vibe, and that's like
Yeah.
not really quantifiable, but it's like it when you see it. There's just like an energy that comes through. And part of that is like the efficacy of it is like take Nike, for example, because we use Nike as a who doesn't want to be like Nike, right? So we use that aspirationally. But Nike can sound like Nike even when they're talking to um really, really hardcore tennis, like absolute passionate tennis junkies, or they are talking to newbies who have never run a trail in their life and who maybe want to think about becoming trail runners. Right. So they can talk across sports and they can talk across like audience levels.
Mhm.
Right. And it can still sound like they are high performance and they can still have that just do it like they're the coach in your corner sensibility. That to me is a strong, effective voice. That story comes through no matter what.
Hmm. I knew your take was gonna be interesting. I love the writing dialogue. Like what a great mindset to put yourself in when you're working on these things. I like the tools, not rules. I'm very aligned with that for sure. Brand as a
Yeah.
person, again, likewise. And I just think that this is not it's as we often find, it's a delicate balance between, having some kind of structure, but also having some kind of sensibility to the actual process. So I definitely think that it's something that probably is trained for everyone. I mean, it necessitates a little bit of, like I said, a little bit of more attention to detail. Even when you were talking about finding the nuggets, I think there is a way to train a little bit your mindset to work to work with verbal identity. I don't think it's such a little bit like how everybody talks about creativity, about how everybody talks about art. There needs to be some of that
Yeah.
intangible aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the creative side is extremely important, and that lens, whether you're, writing it or looking at it and reviewing it, like it's thinking about it through that artistic, creative side is absolutely invaluable. So 100% agree.
Well, thank you very much, William. I appreciate you joining us. And,
Yeah. Thank
maybe we'll
you.
maybe we'll
Thanks
do this
for,
again sometime.
would love that. Thanks for all the comments and the conversation today. It was a joy.
Thank you everyone for joining, and yeah, until the next one, I guess.